Picture this. A misty dawn settles over a small Balkan valley. The air smells of wet earth and sheep wool, a rhythm of bells echoing between the hills, the sound of a life that has never known fear. A 12-year-old boy ties his sandals, helps his father with the flock, and watches smoke curl from his mother's clay oven. Bread, goat's milk, safety, everything simple, everything certain. Then, the ground begins to tremble. Hooves, heavy, relentless, foreign. Men in silk and steel appear through the fog, officials of an empire so vast that its shadow stretches across continents. Their robes shimmer, but their eyes are cold. One raises a hand, points toward the boy, and in that single gesture, a family's world collapses. His mother screams words they do not understand. His father stands frozen, knowing that to resist means death. Within minutes, the boy is taken, promised honor in service to the Sultan, told he will rise to greatness. Yet as the cart wheels grind against the stones of his village, the only sound he hears is his mother's cry, fading into the wind. He does not know that he is one of thousands. He does not know that the empire has perfected the machinery of taking, reshaping children into instruments of faith, obedience, and power. This is not just his story. It is the story of every boy swallowed by the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace. Behind every empire's glory lies the echo of footsteps that never came home. And tonight, we'll follow those footsteps into the heart of the Ottoman court, where survival had a price no child should ever pay. The road stretched endlessly, curling through jagged mountain passes and across plains scorched by the summer sun. The boy's bare feet, once used to soft grass and cool soil, now bled against the sharp stones. Behind him, the distant echo of his mother's cries had faded into the mist of memory, replaced by the grunts of guards and the shuffle of hundreds of boys just like him, stolen, frightened, and silent. The journey to Istanbul had begun, and with it came the first lessons of survival inside an empire that saw them not as children, but as resources to be molded. The Ottoman soldiers called it the collection, but among villagers it had another name, the taking. Each year, riders moved through Christian lands of the Balkans, gathering the strongest and most intelligent boys between the ages of 8 and 16. It was a system of order and terror at once, a machine that fed the empire's endless hunger for soldiers, servants, and scholars. For the boys, it was the end of their past and the uncertain beginning of something far darker. The boy did not know how far they had walked, only that days blended into nights, and the landscape changed like pages in a cruel storybook. The first nights were the hardest. The captives were herded into makeshift camps, a few fires surrounded by soldiers who ate apart, leaving the boys to gnaw on scraps of stale bread. When the wind blew through the valleys, it carried the smell of rain, sweat, and fear. Some cried quietly into their knees. Others stared blankly into the flames, already learning that tears drew attention, and attention meant danger. The guards had their own rhythm. A few were silent professionals, men hardened by the routine of conquest, but others took pleasure in reminding the captives who held the whip. When one boy refused to move at dawn, they dragged him by his hair through the mud until he screamed. Another, older than the rest, tried to run under cover of darkness. He was caught before he reached the tree-line. The punishment was public, deliberate, and final. The guards made the others watch as he was beaten until the snow-white dust of the road turned crimson. That night, the boy couldn't sleep. Every sound, the creak of saddles, the crackle of the fire, the cough of the sick, made him flinch. He thought of home, of his father's steady voice and the smell of fresh bread in the morning, but those memories began to feel like dreams from another life. The road was remaking him, stripping away the softness of childhood and carving something harder in its place. By the end of the second week, patterns emerged. The strong boys were placed at the front, where they set the pace. The weaker ones fell behind, limping, coughing, sometimes collapsing from exhaustion. There was no mercy for them. The soldiers didn't strike them, they simply kept walking. The column moved on, and when morning came, the bodies of those left behind were already cold, eyes open toward a sky that had stopped caring. The lesson was clear: weakness was death. He began to watch and learn. The boy noticed that the ones who survived were not always the strongest, but the quietest, the ones who spoke little, who conserved energy who bowed their heads and did not challenge the rhythm of the guards. Some older boys whispered advice at night. Don't look them in the eye. Don't ask questions. Never stop moving. It became a kind of prayer, repeated silently with every step. Among the boys was one named Nikos, 14, from a fishing village by the Aegean. He had salt in his hair and anger in his heart. On the third night, he whispered that he would escape. They can't keep us all, he said. The sea is close. I can smell it. But when he made his move, slipping away into the dark, his absence lasted less than an hour. The guards found him and brought him back before dawn. The punishment that followed was not only for him. It was for everyone. The soldiers forced the boys into a circle, made them watch. No one dared move, no one dared breathe. The sound of the beating echoed across the hills, dull and heavy. The boy clenched his fists so tightly that his nails cut into his palms, but he made no sound. He learned that day that silence could be armor. Later, when the guards dragged Nikos's limp body aside, one soldier muttered that he would serve the empire better as an example than as a man. After that, no one tried to run. As the days turned into weeks, Istanbul grew closer, though none of the boys had seen it yet. They began to speak of it in whispers, a city of gold domes and marble halls, of fountains that ran with milk and honey. The younger ones clung to these tales like prayers, the older ones knew better. The empire promised glory, but their bruises told another story. The boy's body adapted to the march. His feet hardened, his hunger dulled, and his mind learned the patterns of their captors, when they were alert, when they were tired, when it was safe to breathe. The journey became a kind of schooling, not of books or language, but of instincts. He learned to sleep sitting up, to eat quickly, to hide his strength when eyes lingered too long. By the time they crossed the wide plains of Thrace, the boy who had left home was gone. What remained was someone quieter, sharper, harder. Sometimes, at dawn, he saw the older guards staring at him and the others, not with hatred, but with calculation. They were counting, assessing, deciding who might survive the palace and who would break before reaching it. And though he didn't yet understand, this was the first glimpse of the logic that would define his new life. The empire's love for talent was inseparable from its appetite for control. One night, a storm swept across the camp, rain slashing sideways, lightning ripping the sky. The boys huddled together under their thin blankets, shivering, terrified. The boy pressed his back against a tree trunk and stared into the storm. For the first time, he realized that nature was kinder than men. The rain did not judge. It did not take names or demand obedience. It fell on everyone equally, captor and captive alike. When morning came, half the fires had drowned, and a few boys never woke up. The soldiers simply buried them by the road and moved on. When the hills finally opened to reveal the faint silver line of the Marmara Sea, a strange quiet fell over the column. The guards straightened their uniforms. The boys, ragged and barefoot, watched the horizon where water met sky. Somewhere beyond that line was Istanbul, the city of their fate. The boy stood at the crest of the hill, wind tearing through his hair. For a heartbeat, he felt something like awe. The towers and domes glittered faintly in the distance, kissed by sunlight. It should have been beautiful, but beauty, he would learn, could be the cruelest disguise of all. That night, as the camp settled near the city's outskirts, he could not sleep. The air smelled different here, salt, smoke, and the strange sweetness of civilization. The older boys whispered that tomorrow they would be examined, measured, chosen. His stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from dread. He did not know what awaited him behind the palace gates, only that it would demand everything he still had left, his name, his faith, and perhaps even the last fragments of his soul. The next morning, when the sun rose over Istanbul, the boy's eyes were dry. He had no tears left. He had learned the first law of the empire, a rule that would follow him through every marble corridor and gilded room he would ever walk. Weakness is death. The first glimpse of Istanbul should have been magnificent. After weeks of marching through mud, hunger, and grief, the city appeared like a mirage on the horizon, its domes gleaming beneath the morning sun, its countless minarets rising like silver spears piercing the sky. For the boys, it looked at first like salvation. They whispered to each other in trembling voices, wondering if perhaps all the suffering had led them here for a reason. Maybe the stories were true. Maybe this was where they would become soldiers, scholars, or heroes. But as the column drew closer, the illusion began to crumble. The air grew thick with smoke and the heavy stench of the harbor, fish, sweat, and rot. The shouts of merchants mingled with the cries of slaves unloading ships. The marble gates loomed higher with every step, not like doors to a sacred city, but like the jaws of a beast ready to devour them whole. The grandeur was real, yes, but so was the dread that coiled beneath it. The boy, now gaunt and silent from the long road, felt a strange tightening in his chest. He had imagined Istanbul as a city of light, but what he saw was motion and noise, power and indifference. Everything here was bigger, faster, colder. The guards who escorted them grew quiet as they neared the palace district, straightening their posture and checking their weapons. Even they seemed smaller under the vast stone walls of Topkapi. The group was halted before the outer gates. The boys were told to stand in rows. The soldiers who had accompanied them so far handed them over to officials in long, dark robes, scribes and overseers who carried lists written in looping Arabic script. They did not speak to the boys. They examined them. One by one, they walked down the line, taking notes, pointing, murmuring. The boy stood perfectly still, heart pounding in his chest, his mind blank except for the rhythm of his own breath. When the first official reached him, the man's eyes darted quickly across his face, his shoulders, his hands. He muttered something to another scribe, who wrote it down. Then, without warning, he lifted the boy's chin with 2 fingers and turned his head side to side, as though inspecting livestock. The touch was not cruel, just impersonal, and that made it worse. In that moment, the boy understood his new place in the world. He was no longer someone's son. He was inventory. Around him, other boys trembled or cried out. Some were dismissed with a wave of the hand, sent toward the barracks where the janissaries were trained. Others, those with finer features, straighter posture, or quicker minds, were separated into a smaller group. The boy was one of them. He didn't know it yet, but he had been chosen for something more refined and far more dangerous, the palace school, Indiran. As the selected group was led through the gates, the sounds of the city faded behind them, replaced by something even more unnerving, silence. The air inside the palace walls was cooler, perfumed faintly with rosewater and polished marble. Sunlight filtered through latticed windows, scattering delicate patterns across the floor. Servants moved quietly, their steps muffled. For a moment, it felt almost holy, a sanctuary of order and beauty. But beneath that beauty, the boy sensed an invisible weight pressing down on him. Every gesture, every sound, every glance seemed calculated. The men in charge walked with the slow, deliberate confidence of those who knew their power would never be questioned. The guards at every corner stood motionless, eyes forward, their scimitars gleaming. Even the air felt choreographed. They were led through a series of courtyards, each grander than the last. The first was filled with fountains and manicured gardens, a paradise for the eyes. But the boys noticed something strange. Though everything looked perfect, there were no birds. The silence, broken only by the trickle of water, was unnatural. It was the silence of control. The second courtyard was lined with columns of pale stone. There, the officials halted them again. Another round of inspections followed. Teeth, eyes, skin, posture. The boy clenched his fists as one attendant examined the back of his neck and wrists. The man nodded approvingly and wrote a note on a small parchment. Nearby, a shorter official scribbled something beside another boy's name and gestured to a soldier. The boy was taken away immediately, his face twisted in confusion. None of them ever saw him again. When it was over, those who remained were told they had been accepted for palace service. The guards smiled, but their smiles were not kind. "You will serve the Sultan," one said in Turkish, slowly, so that even the foreigners could understand. "You are fortunate." The tone made it clear that fortune had nothing to do with it. They were led deeper into the complex, past libraries with gilded doors, kitchens that smelled of roasted lamb, halls where tapestries shimmered in the lamplight. The boy's eyes darted everywhere, unable to take it all in. The beauty was dizzying. He wanted to admire it, to be amazed, but fear kept his body tense. This was not a place of wonder. It was a machine, beautiful, efficient, and utterly inescapable. Finally, they reached the dormitory. It was a long hall of marble floors and high arched ceilings. Rows of narrow beds stood side by side, each covered with a silk blanket and a small cushion. The boy touched the fabric, soft, cold, unfamiliar. For the first time since leaving home, he would sleep under a roof. Yet as he lay down that night, he felt less safe than ever. The silence of the dormitory was suffocating. Somewhere in the darkness, someone whispered a prayer. Someone else sobbed quietly into their pillow. The boy stared at the ceiling until his eyes burned. He tried to remember his mother's face, but it came to him like a painting seen through smoke. He could recall her voice, but not her words. He wanted to hold onto those memories, yet the more he tried, the further they slipped away. Sleep came late and fitful. When he woke, the cross that he had hidden in his tunic, the last piece of his old life, was gone. Someone had found it. Later that morning, they were lined up again. A priest of the Empire's faith recited verses in a language the boy did not know. Then, one by one, the boys were given new names. He was no longer who he had been. The sound of his birth name vanished into the air like smoke, replaced by a new identity spoken by a stranger's mouth. The ceremony was solemn, almost theatrical. The officials spoke of honor, service, and destiny. But for the boy, every word felt like another layer of distance between him and the world he had lost. When it was done, he looked down at his hands and barely recognized them. The same hands that once herded sheep and gathered firewood, now shaking beneath silk cuffs. Outside, through the lattice of the window, the city of Istanbul glittered in the afternoon light. The domes shone gold. The sea shimmered silver. The call to prayer echoed over the rooftops, filling the air with something vast and eternal. It should have sounded divine. But to the boy standing there in silence, it sounded like the closing of a door that would not open again. He was inside the most magnificent city on earth, and yet he had never felt further from home. They assembled the boys in a long colonnade where the marble stayed cool even in afternoon heat. Light fell through latticed screens, breaking into patterns on the floor like a net. It felt appropriate. Everything here was about nets, how to cast them, how to pull them tight, how to sort the catch. A scribe read names that were not their own, copied from the lists gathered on the road. Another official carried a stick with notches inked along its length. He pressed each boy's heels against the wall, leveled the stick above the head, and called out a number. Height, then weight. Teeth next, lips pulled back with gloved fingers, the jaw turned left and right. Eyes, follow my hand. Look at the lamp, do not blink. Hands, palms up, palms down, the lines examined as if they were maps to a distant future. The inspection was efficient, almost graceful in its precision. It would have been beautiful if it were not being done to children. The boy kept his gaze on the floor. He had learned from the march that stillness was a kind of shield. When his turn came, a steward lifted his chin. The man's face was unreadable. He might have been appraising a piece of porcelain. Straight back. The steward said in Turkish, and the boy obeyed. The scribe murmured something about symmetry, and the steward nodded as though the word had value in coin. They tested reflexes. A palm flashed toward his face. He did not flinch. A cup fell. His hand shot out to catch it before it struck the stone. The official's eyebrow lifted a fraction. They tested memory. A sequence of words, unfamiliar and harsh, was spoken at him twice. He repeated them back, not perfectly, but close. They tested attention. Count the bell strikes. A voice said. A weak chime sounded somewhere beyond the courtyard. He counted. 1, 2, 3. He did not turn his head to look. He had learned not to seek sources of danger with his eyes. Language came last. A tutor in a crimson sash spoke a few phrases in Turkish, simple things. Where are you from? What is your name? The boy answered with the broken vocabulary he had gathered from guards and murmured orders. Then the tutor switched to Persian, then Arabic. The boy shook his head. The tutor did not seem disappointed. Discovery, not failure, was the point. Enderun candidate, the tutor said, making a mark. The words settled like a stone in the boy's chest. He did not know precisely what it meant, only that it placed him in a smaller, more closely watched herd. Around him, the sorting accelerated. Boys with broader shoulders and coarser hands, those whose gaze never rose above a soldier's belt, were sent toward the Janissary barracks. There was dignity in that line. Fear too, but something legible. Training, duties, a path that ended on battlefields and in parade ranks. The Inderun line was different. It was thinner, quieter, composed of faces the officials looked at for a fraction longer. A few boys stood there because of quick minds, a few because of posture and poise, a few because beauty, even in childhood, is a currency that empires never stop minting. They moved the chosen into a smaller court, shaded by cypress. A fountain murmured, swallows cut the air. The piece felt deliberate, like music designed to soften resistance. An overseer stepped forward and spoke with a rehearsal's ease. "You will learn," he said, in slow Turkish, then repeated the meaning in another tongue for those who needed it. "You will be taught to read and write. You will study law, mathematics, languages, history, and the arts. You will sleep under roofs of stone and eat food prepared by the Sultan's kitchens. If you work hard, if you obey, you will rise." The promises were true in their own way. That was part of the brilliance. A lie wholly told is easy to resist. A truth sharpened to a point can pierce any armor. "Your old names will be recorded," he continued, "and you will be given new ones. Your old ways will be placed aside, and you will learn the ways of the palace. This is not punishment. This is privilege." The boy heard the word and understood its shape, but not its flavor. Privilege felt like a cloak placed over his shoulders in a room where windows would not open. They were led to a cloister where tutors waited at tables set with slate, ink, and reed pens. The first lesson was posture. How to sit with a straight back so breathing stayed deep and the mind alert. The second lesson was the alphabet, curves like vines, dots like stars, letters that joined hands to form words that looked like braided river channels. The teacher guided the boy's hand with the gentlest pressure, as if reminding him that force could arrive softly. In the next chamber, a musician plucked at an oud, notes rising like birds startled from a tree. "Listen," the master said. "Count silently. Rhythm is obedience, melody is grace. You will need both." The boy's fingers, clumsy from the road, learned to obey a different kind of discipline. Then came movement. In a courtyard painted with sun, a drill master taught them to walk. Not march, walk. He adjusted shoulder angles, corrected foot placement, demonstrated how to enter a room and take a place that was neither too humble nor too bold. "Power notices posture before it hears words," he said, and the sentence branded itself onto the boy's mind. At midday, the boys ate in silence at long tables. A steward passed between rows, setting down bread and stewed lentils. No one reached early, no one reached late. The boy tasted something he had not felt since the road began, a faint return of appetite. When the bowl was empty, he placed the spoon exactly where he had found it. He had learned that small rituals were the palace's true grammar. Afternoon brought the strangest task, a lesson in watching. The tutor led them to a balcony above a busy court. "You will stand here," he said, "and notice." He did not say what. For an hour, the boys observed the traffic below, servants, guards, scribes, gardeners trimming a hedge, a falconer with a hooded bird perched on his fist. The boy's eyes traced the paths, the timings, the nods. He saw which doors opened for which robes, which corridors were for feet, and which for wheels, where shadows lingered longer on warm stone. Only later did he realize what the palace was teaching. That knowledge of patterns is another name for survival. As the light shifted, they were given new garments, simple, clean, undecorated. Linen replaced rags. Leather slippers replaced bleeding feet. The boy held his old shirt for a moment. It seemed filled with dust and road. He thought of keeping it hidden, but there was nowhere to hide anything here, not objects, not thoughts. He laid it on a pile with the others and felt a string pulled taut somewhere behind his ribs. That evening, an older student came through the dormitory speaking softly, the way a cat announces itself before leaping onto a bed. He looked at each face as if deciding where to place a small investment. When he reached the boy, he smiled with only the corner of his mouth. "First day," the older student said. "You listened. Good. Listening keeps bones unbroken." He placed a folded scrap of paper on the boy's blanket. "These are the phrases you will need tomorrow morning. Learn them. Speak only when asked. Do exactly as you were shown. And," he paused, "do not get noticed unless you mean to." He left before the boy could reply. The scrap held a list of courtesies in Turkish and Persian, the simplest blades in a new language armory. The boy whispered them until his tongue could find the edges without thinking. Night fell as quietly as a curtain. The dormitory breathed in unison, dozens of chests rising and falling beneath silk that felt like water. Somewhere beyond the walls, a muezzin's call braided with sea wind. The boy lay on his back and watched the pattern of moonlight sift through the lattice and pool on the floor. The day had been full of thresholds, each crossed so smoothly that he almost missed the moment of crossing. He thought of the measuring stick, the inked notches, the hands that turned his face left and right. He thought of the word the scribe had written beside his name, candidate. In the Rhodes school, he had learned that weakness was death. In the palace's school, he suspected, the lesson would be subtler. That survival demands not only strength, but shape. How to bend without breaking. How to take on the form required without dissolving into it. He closed his eyes and followed his breathing down into darkness. Tomorrow, another net would be cast. Tomorrow, he would learn whether he could slip through its knots or if he would have to grow into them. At dawn, the palace bells did not ring. They breathed. A low bronze hush rolled over the courtyards and into the dormitory like a tide, lifting the boys from sleep without a shout or a whip. The sound was deliberate, almost kind. That was how the palace preferred to teach, by surrounding you with rituals so smooth you forgot when you agreed to them. An attendant passed between the beds, placing folded garments at each pillow, fresh linen tunics, a narrow sash, soft leather slippers. The boy touched the cloth with hesitant fingers. It was neither rough like home nor luxurious like the silk he'd seen on noble robes. It sat perfectly between the two, a careful choice, like everything here. Dress, the attendant said, not unkindly. No one spoke back. Linen slid over skin that still remembered the road's dust. When the boy tightened the sash, he felt as if he were tying shut a book whose first chapters he could no longer reread. They were led to the ablutions chamber, white tile glistening with thin sheets of steam. Brass basins glowed in the lamplight. A steward demonstrated the sequence with practiced grace. Water across hands, face, arms, head. Clean body, he said in Turkish, tapping his chest, then his temple, clean thought. It was hygiene, yes, but also choreography, a simple dance that synchronized strangers. The boy imitated each motion until his fingers remembered the order without his eyes. When he looked up, the mirror's burnished surface offered him a face he recognized and did not. The same bones, now framed by a stranger's calm. From there, the procession thickened, like a river moving toward a delta. The boys filed into a chamber lined with latticed windows and a floor of veined marble that seemed to hold its own light. At the far end, beneath a canopy embroidered with verses, officials waited beside a table stacked with ledgers. A smell of rosewater drifted through the air, delicate enough to hide the scent of ink and authority. A scholar in pale robes stepped forward, a man whose eyes carried both fatigue and certainty. He spoke in Turkish, and when that failed for some, he offered the gist in other tongues. You have come to the heart of order, he said. Here you will receive instruction and purpose. Here, the confusion of the road ends. Purpose. The word was a bridge offered to boys who had been walking without one. The ceremony began without fanfare. One by one, they were called to the table. A clerk read each boy's birth name quietly, then dipped his pen and wrote it into the ledger with a line that felt like a farewell. A second entry followed. The new name, rounded vowels, careful consonants, something that fit the tongue of the empire. When the boy stepped forward, time seemed to soften at the edges. He heard his old name spoken, 2 syllables that tasted of wood smoke and pasture, and then watched it vanish into paper. From this day, the scholar intoned, "You are," and the new sound fell upon him like a cloak. It didn't hurt. It settled. That was the unsettling part. A thin cord was placed around his wrist. A simple thread dyed the red of pomegranate skin. A reminder, said the attendant, fastening it. Of what, he didn't say. The boy felt the thread as a gentle pulse against his skin, a beat he could not ignore. Next came the lesson he'd expected and feared. The scholar recited phrases from the empire's faith, words the boy didn't fully understand but could feel arranging themselves like stones in a path. The boys were not asked to debate, they were asked to repeat. The rhythm carried them. The boy mouthed the lines with the rest, stumbling only once on a sound his village had never needed. He did not feel lightning. He felt the cool draft that follows a door quietly closing. Afterward, a tutor explained not theology but practice. Order is built from habits, he said. Time set aside for washing, for prayer, for study. A mind is a garden. Left alone, it grows wild. Tended, it grows useful. He spoke without menace, and that was the genius. Duty framed as cultivation. Even hunger could be taught to nod along. The boys were led to a side room where a small table waited for each of them. Atop each table, a blank slate, a reed pen, a shallow dish of ink, and a small scrap of parchment bearing the new name in precise script. Copy, the writing master said, voice soft as felt. Again, slowly. The boy traced the curves and dots, his wrist unsteady at first, then steadier, until the shape no longer felt like a foreign animal, but like a creature he could feed and guide. With each repetition, a strange thing happened. The name grew heavier, not because it crushed him, but because it began to fit. He hated that. He also loved the feeling of mastery. The palace knew it would. At midday, they ate beneath a colonnade, the sea breeze threading through pillars to cool their cheeks. Bowls of lentils, flatbread, slices of melon. No one rushed. A steward corrected a boy's grip on the spoon with 2 fingers and a whisper. Small habits become large destinies, he said. The boy tasted the phrase alongside the food and found that both went down easily. In the afternoon, a different lesson, silence that listens. The tutor took them to a courtyard where a fountain's lip sang a constant thread of water. Attend, he said. Not to me, to this. He meant the world. The gardeners measured steps, the guard's gaze pivoting between corners, the scribe's pen tapping twice when the ink thinned. The boy realized that attention was being trained like a muscle. Some empires built walls. This one built perception. The dormitory, when they returned, seemed less like a hall and more like a hive. Each bed had its geometry. Each chest beneath it carried the same linen smell. On each pillow lay a thin booklet, prayers and phrases, schedules and courtesies. The boy turned the pages as if turning the spokes of a wheel that had already been set in motion. Only when he slipped a hand inside his tunic did he remember the small wooden cross he'd hidden there, the last twig from the forest of his old life. His fingers met nothing but cloth. At some point between basin and slate, someone had found it and taken it away. No drama, no scolding. The absence felt like a ghost brushing his shoulder. He sat very still, back straight, eyes on the lattice where a diamond of sky showed through. Loss, he realized, did not always arrive as a blow. Sometimes it simply failed to arrive with you. As the sun declined, the older student returned, the same one who had offered him phrases the previous night. He checked each boy's sash, adjusted a collar here, a slipper there, the way a brother might fix a younger brother before a public recitation. Your name? He asked the boy. The boy spoke the new one. The older student nodded. Remember the old one, he added, almost inaudible. You don't have to say it aloud for it to remain yours. Then he moved on. The boy held that sentence like embers in his palms. Twilight entered the palace the way ink enters water, one shade deepening another. The call to prayer unfurled from the minarets, a ribbon of sound threading through courtyards and over rooftops to the sea. The boys lined up, not marched, aligned like notes on a staff. They followed the gestures they'd been shown, the sequence already half-lived earlier at the basin. The boy moved with them, his body answering instructions it had only just learned. When it ended, a tutor spoke one last time that day. Names are boats, he said. They carry you. Some of you have crossed into new boats today. Keep the river, and you will not drown. The metaphor puzzled the boy and then soothed him. He thought of the rope at his wrist, the ink on his slate, the smoothness of the linen where his rough shirt had been. He thought of the cross, not in his palm, but in the shape his fingers kept seeking. He understood that identity here was not erased in a single act. It was diluted in 1,000 clear waters until you could no longer measure where the old ended and the new began. Night pressed its cool hand to the windows. The dormitory exhaled. The boy lay down and stared at the dark silver pool of moonlight on the floor. He whispered his birth name once, just loud enough for his breath to hear it. Then he whispered the new one. Both sounds lived in the same chest. Somewhere beyond the walls the city continued, merchants tallying, waves licking stone, a falcon settling on a glove. Here, inside the palace, another tally had begun, not of coin or grain, but of hearts that would bend and not break. The boy did not know which he would be. He only knew that tomorrow he would wake when the bell breathed again, wash in the basin's cool logic, tie the sash, and speak the name he'd been given. And beneath it, quiet as a seed in winter, he would keep the other. The palace taught in hours, not in lectures. Before the sun rose, the bell breathed its low bronze note, and the boys rose with it. Beds straightened, linens folded to the finger's width, slippers aligned beneath the frame. A steward passed in silence, eyes skimming like a plumb line, and if a corner lifted or a blanket sagged, a chalk mark appeared at the footboard, a tiny debt added to the day's ledger. The boy learned quickly that here, order began long before knowledge. They washed in the ablutions room where steam veiled the mirrors, then moved in file through a corridor that smelled faintly of ink and warm bread. The first lesson was posture, not vanity, but architecture. A tutor pressed his palm between shoulder blades until the spine found its column. A straight back, he said, gives the mind a straight road. The sentence sounded ceremonial, yet by the third morning the boy noticed his breathing had deepened, and words on the page no longer swam. Writing followed. Mats unrolled, slates set out, reed pens trimmed with a penknife so fine it seemed to whisper. The script was a garden of curves and stars, lines that joined hands and, when placed correctly, seemed to bow to one another. The master sat beside each boy, guiding wrist and knuckle. Discipline lived in the fingers. Lift at the end of a stroke, breathe before the next. The boy's letters were clumsy at first, ink blotted like night rain, but repetition smoothed them. When he finally traced his new name without a tremor, a small pebble of pride dropped into his chest. The palace counted on that pebble. After writing came numbers. Pebbles migrated onto a tray, ones, fives, tens. The master arranged them into neat constellations and then covered half with a cloth. Now tell me what remains, he said, and the boys learned to see what was hidden. From pebbles they climbed to abacuses, from abacuses to ledgers, and the boy began to understand that arithmetic was not just quantity, it was pattern. To balance the page was to balance the day. They crossed a courtyard stippled with sun to the library, a room that breathed dust and light. Latticed windows cast nets across the floor, and within those squares lay books, each wrapped in cloth like a sleeping animal. A librarian with eyebrows like ink strokes unwrapped a volume of poetry and another of law. He placed them side by side, as if introducing two guests who ought to speak. To govern, he murmured, one must hear both song and statute. The boy traced the margins with his eyes, catching on words that tasted of distant cities. He did not yet know the meanings, but he recognized the size of them, and that recognition alone enlarged him. By mid-morning they studied languages. Turkish was the water, Persian and Arabic the channels that carried it through gardens of thought. The tutor used proverbs like keys. Tie your camel, then trust, he said, and made them turn the phrase in all three tongues until its shape shone from every angle. The boy discovered that each language carved different roads through the same hill. On some, meaning climbed in spirals. On others, it went straight up a stair. Once a week, they climbed the astronomy terrace, where an armillary sphere spun gold in the light. A scholar pointed to a star and named it, then traced invisible lines that tethered it to another. The heavens move in obedience, he said, and so may a city. The boy peered through a tube and felt the quiet pull of distances. Down in the kitchens, pots clattered and flame hissed, but up here sound fell away. Only the turning remained. He did not understand the math yet, but he grasped the doctrine. Order has music. There was literal music, too. In a cool room hung with instruments, the master of the oud set a metronome with his foot, the tap of a sandal on stone, and the boys followed. Scales poured across the air like ropes thrown from shore to shore. When one boy hurried a note, the master stopped, not angry but precise. Time will not be rushed, he said. The boy took it into his bones. Power may stride, but time walks. Meals were their own lesson. Bowls arrived at once, steam rising in a brief chorus. No one reached until the steward's signal. No one left morsels untouched. The boy learned to eat exactly enough, neither hoarding nor performing hunger. If someone spilled, another handed a cloth without words. To ask for praise spoiled the deed. It was not piety they practiced, but frictionless movement, a choreography of regard. Afternoons brought service. tasks that polished both marble and ego. Some boys swept corridors. Others carried messages or tended the herb beds that made the kitchen smell of lemon and mint. The boy found himself in the scriptorium more often than not, grinding ink with a stone, filling the wells that fed the pens of men who decided futures. He understood that ink is a quiet army. It takes cities without a sound. Here he first sensed the palace's economy of privilege. A tutor's nod yielded an extra sheet of practice paper. A steward's silence erased a chalk mark at a bed's foot. A pair of slippers rested nearer a warm brazier for the boy who had memorized a page of verse. None of it looked like coin, but here, warmth and paper and the absence of penalty were as good as gold. He watched how favors moved, sideways, rarely down, never up without interest. He practiced being grateful without being owned. Each afternoon, there was an hour that belonged to watching. The boy stood at a balcony and learned the map of the palace by flow, not by stones. A gardener trimmed a hedge in exact rectangles. A page traversed the same arc across the court at the same minute each day. A guard's gaze flickered past the same columns in a loop that would have looked random to anyone who wasn't counting. The tutor asked no questions. Still, all answers were being collected. The boy learned to keep a second ledger behind his eyes. There were punishments, of course, measured, inventive, and always public without being brutal. A boy who spoke out of turn copied a page of law until the ink stained his cuticles. Another who cut the posture lesson, twice, ate his lentils standing with a book on his head. The message was not fear, but friction. Resist, and your day grows heavy. Comply, and it slides. At dusk, they learned etiquette, which turned out to be politics written in the body. How far to bow to a tutor, how much farther to a steward. How to carry a message, right hand, left hand free. How to enter a room when called, and how to leave one when spared. Speech persuades, the etiquette master said, but posture convinces. The boy began practicing in the reflections of darkened windows until the angles settled into him like stars into a chart. The older student, the one whose advice arrived like folded paper, checked on him after lights out. He spoke softly, eyes on the door. You're learning fast, he said, but learn where to be average. Excellence draws looks. Looks draw claims. He gestured at the boy's neat letters. 3 perfect lines, then one with a human mistake. Enough to be trusted, not enough to be taken. The counsel felt like a secret path sketched in lamplight. The boy stored it with his proverbs. And there were moments of grace, small as cumin seeds, and just as potent. On the terrace one evening, the astronomy master set a chart before the boy and asked him to mark the moon's path. The boy hesitated, then drew a line that curved a breath sooner than the model. The master's brow lifted. You saw the veil of cloud, he said. You adjusted. He placed a date stone in the boy's palm. Observation over imitation. The sweetness carried him through a week. By now, the palace's double truth had become clear. It genuinely educated. Languages, numbers, song, stars. It also trained obedience, habits, schedule, service. The two were woven so tightly that pulling one thread clenched the other. When the boy stood at the end of a long day, he could feel both strings humming in him. The thrill of skill, the weight of compliance. He wondered if there was a way to keep the first without being owned by the second. That night, as the bell's bronze breath folded the day, he lay still and recited his private litany. Straighten the blanket. Breathe into the spine. Letters lift at the end. Numbers balance. Watch the corners. 3 perfect. 1 human. Observe the cloud. He did not pray, not in any formal tongue, but the list felt like a compact with himself, an oath to remain a person inside the uniform of a pupil. Beyond the lattice, Istanbul murmured, oars feathering the Bosphorus, a donkey braying on a distant quay, traders bargaining in a last blue spill of evening. Inside, the dormitory exhaled in unison. The boy slid the date stone beneath his pillow and turned once to smooth the linen, exactly by a finger's width. Tomorrow would come with its measured mercy, its bells and basins, its pins and postures, its privileges and their cost. He closed his eyes knowing this much. Knowledge could make a cage larger. But if he learned the bars well enough, counted them, named them, charted the light that fell between, perhaps one day he could walk their pattern without being caught by it. The longer the boy lived within the marble labyrinth of Topkapi, the more he realized that knowledge was only one side of the education. The other was silence, the art of obedience, learned not from words but from glances, from the spaces between sounds. It began with subtle lessons. The tutors praised precision, but they also praised charm. The way a bow curved too gracefully, the way an answer was offered with eyes slightly lifted, the way the younger boys learned to smile when spoken to. Grace, one instructor told them, is intelligence made visible. The phrase lingered in the boy's mind long after the lesson ended. He did not yet understand that in the palace, grace could be currency, and currency could buy safety. The older students drifted through the dormitories at night like shadows in silk. They carried themselves with the ease of boys who had survived long enough to learn how to blend elegance with power. They whispered advice, how to speak to the tutors, how to make oneself invisible when danger approached. But behind their calm eyes lay something the boy couldn't name, a hollow, practiced detachment that seemed both wise and broken. One night, he awoke to the sound of muffled footsteps. The torchlight from the corridors spilled through the lattice door, painting honey-colored stripes across the floor. An older student, perhaps 16, entered quietly, smiling, his expression kind but unreadable. He sat on the edge of the boy's bed, spoke softly about the classes, about how quickly the boy was learning, how much potential he had. Then, his hand rested lightly on the boy's shoulder. "You must learn more than letters and numbers," he said. "The palace demands many kinds of excellence." His voice carried neither cruelty nor warmth, only inevitability. The boy froze. His breath caught somewhere between fear and confusion. The older student's hand slid from shoulder to wrist, lingering, testing. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink. The marble walls pressed closer. The boy did not speak, did not move. He remembered the advice whispered on the road. Silence is armor. When the older boy finally left, the boy lay awake for hours, staring at the faint pattern of moonlight on the ceiling. He felt shame without understanding its cause, shame mixed with survival. The next morning, no one spoke of it. No one ever did. It was as though the night itself had swallowed the memory. That day, the lessons resumed as if nothing had happened. The tutor of etiquette instructed them in the art of serving nobles, how to pour wine, how to bow precisely without lowering one's gaze too far. Every motion must be balanced, the tutor said. Even obedience has posture. The boy noticed that certain students, those favored by the instructors, were assigned easier duties, better meals, warmer robes. Others, who had resisted or withdrawn, seemed to fade into invisibility. One morning, the bed beside his was empty. No one asked why. The steward simply replaced the bedding before dawn, as though the boy had never existed. That absence haunted him more than punishment could. It taught him that in this place, disappearance was not failure, it was erasure. Weeks turned into months. The boy learned Turkish poetry, Persian calligraphy, the laws of inheritance, the codes of diplomacy. His hand became steady, his language fluent, his movements graceful. Outwardly, he was thriving. Inwardly, he was hardening, learning to hide himself inside the perfect shape of obedience. One afternoon, during a music lesson, the chief eunuch entered, a tall figure dressed in black silk, his presence so commanding that the air seemed to still around him. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Even the tutors bowed their heads. The eunuch's eyes scanned the room like a blade passing over each boy's skin. "The Sultan has guests," he said simply. "We will send attendants to serve in the outer hall." The boys were chosen in silence. Beauty mattered as much as discipline. The boy's name, his new name, was called. His stomach twisted. He bowed, heart pounding, and followed the eunuch through the labyrinthine corridors toward the illuminated halls where the empire's elite gathered. The outer reception hall shimmered like a dream. Gold leaf ceilings, polished floors reflecting torchlight, fountains murmuring between columns. Men in jeweled turbans and embroidered robes reclined on cushions, discussing politics, conquest, poetry. The air was thick with perfume and roasted spices. The eunuch positioned the boys at the edge of the room. "You are ornaments," he whispered, "but living ones. Move with grace. Speak when spoken to. Remember, the Sultan's guests see everything." The boy carried a silver tray of sherbet, his hands steady despite the tremor inside. When one noble gestured for a refill, he stepped forward exactly as he had been taught. 3 steps, bow, pour, retreat. The noble smiled faintly. The palace trains them well, he murmured to another. The compliment landed like a chain disguised as a garland. Throughout the evening, the boy watched and listened. He saw older attendants exchanging glances with officials, saw how a smile could secure favor, how a moment's hesitation could bring silent punishment. The room was a theater, every gesture rehearsed, every word a move on a board he had not known existed. When it ended, the eunuch dismissed them with a nod. As they walked back through the dark corridors, the boy realized that the palace's cruelty was not always loud. It was ritualized, aesthetic, wrapped in beauty so perfect it blinded the senses. The same marble that reflected sunlight by day reflected power by night. Smooth, cold, indifferent. Back in the dormitory, he found a small token on his bed, a silk ribbon, embroidered with gold thread. It was the mark of approval. For some, it meant progress. For him, it felt like a warning. Approval here was never a gift. It was a hook. That night, he dreamed of his mother, her hands rough from work, her face blurred by fog. In the dream, she stood by the door of their cottage, calling his name. But no sound came from her mouth. When he tried to answer, his voice broke into a language he barely recognized. He woke with the taste of salt on his lips. Days became indistinguishable. Learning, serving, smiling, surviving. Some boys adapted completely, their laughter hollow but confident. Others withdrew into silence, their eyes dim like extinguished candles. The boy balanced between both worlds, obedient enough to live, distant enough to remember. One evening, during a philosophy lesson, the tutor asked, "What is freedom?" The question floated in the air like incense smoke. The boys hesitated, afraid to answer incorrectly. Finally, one whispered, "Obedience to the right master." The tutor smiled. A wise answer. The boy felt the weight of those words sink into him. He wanted to believe them. It would make life easier. But somewhere deep beneath the layers of training, a quieter thought stirred. Freedom might be remembering who you were before someone else told you who to become. He did not speak it aloud. He simply nodded, wrote down the approved answer, and kept the other truth hidden like a secret coin beneath his tongue. Later that night, as the lamps were extinguished one by one, the boy lay awake and realized that his real education had just begun. It was not in language or law, not in music or astronomy. It was in learning how to survive without surrendering completely. The palace had turned obedience into art. Now he had to learn the art of disobedience, quietly, invisibly, so that no one could see it forming. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, the whisper returned to him, from somewhere deep in memory, somewhere that still smelled of sheep and morning mist. "Remember, my son, not every silence means acceptance." He would carry that whisper like a blade hidden beneath velvet for the rest of his life. By the time spring light thinned across the marble courtyards, the boy had learned that the palace did not run only on bells and orders. It ran on a quiet economy the ledgers never named, an unspoken trade of warmth, paper, silence, and proximity. Privilege here was not gold, it was friction reduced. Those who moved without resistance moved far. He first noticed it at breakfast. Bowls arrived at the tables with the same ladle strokes, the same measured portions. Yet some bowls steamed longer, some bread had a softer crust, some water felt less metallic on the tongue. It was never obvious, that was the point. A tutor's nod, a steward's memory, the neatness of a bed, each shaved a sliver off the day's difficulty. Favors slid like oil under a door. One didn't see the hand, only the ease afterward. In the scriptorium, this economy was visible to those who watched. Inkstones were rationed, reed pens sharpened on a schedule, but the boy who had copied a verse flawlessly yesterday found an extra sheet at his station today. The one who asked fewer questions received a place nearer the lamp. The boy learned to grind ink just a breath slower than perfect, enough to be useful without becoming indispensable to a single hand. He remembered the older student's counsel, 3 perfect lines, then one with a human mistake. He discovered the traffic of soft currencies. A page of paper for a memorized proverb. 10 minutes by the brazier for a delivered message with the right bow. A missed chalk mark erased by a steward who had been spared embarrassment during inspection. He traded in these with care. A favor accepted meant a favor owed. A favor refused created a ledger of grievance. The safest debt was the shared task, helping another boy practice calligraphy while both were watched, grinding ink together at a public table. Aloud, they traded letters. Silently, they traded protection. The older boys knew this economy best. They could walk a corridor and change someone's month with a glance. Some used it cruelly, collecting worshippers. Others used it like surgeons, cutting away a punishment before it could scar. The boy watched them and learned to borrow shade without living under it. When an older student offered him a seat near the brazier too often, he declined once and 3 times. Gratitude, visible. Attachment, deniable. Each afternoon, the balcony lesson in observation became a market study. He counted the guards' rotations, noted which door hinges were oiled and which complained, memorized which tutors arrived with breathless hurry and which drifted like music. He placed these details in his second ledger, the one behind his eyes, where use and risk were balanced like numbers on a merchant's page. Then came the week the air changed, sharp as iron, quick as weather. Rumor moved faster than broom strokes. Someone had tried to escape. The palace did not announce such things. It didn't have to. Absence spoke for itself. A bed went smooth and flat at dawn. The blanket was folded away. A different boy's sandals appeared beneath the frame by noon. In the courtyard, voices dipped when a name approached. The boy watched fear compute itself in other boys' eyes. If he can disappear for one kind of reason, I can disappear for any. 2 days later, the palace made its calculation public. At midday, a bell struck once, not for prayer, not for class. The boys were gathered in the main court, lined up by dormitories. The air tasted of salt from the nearby sea. Gulls turned white loops against a sky too blue for what came next. A file of guards entered, slow and quiet, and behind them, between them, walked the runaway. He was not broken, not paraded in chains. That would have been obvious, and the palace avoided the obvious when precision would do. His hair was still wet. His lips were pale from effort and cold. He had tried the water, then, the Golden Horn is highway, not moat. The boy's stomach tightened. He imagined night. The look of the city's lights like spilled gold on black glass. The dizzy hope of cold water against hot fear. The chief eunuch spoke without raising his voice. He went to the water, he said. He thought distance is the same as freedom. He paused, letting the lesson gather around the boy like fog. Distance carries your body. Freedom carries your name. The punishment was neither spectacle nor mercy. The runaway was assigned the hardest service for a month. Hauling water amphory up the long stair from the baths, copying law by lamplight until the skins of his fingers turned dusk-colored with ink, sleeping far from the brazier's warmth. He would not be harmed in a way that alarmed the empire's guests. He would be bent, and all who watched would bend with him. That night, the dormitory buzzed under its breath. The boy lay awake and replayed the eunuch's sentence until it cut 2 ways. If freedom carries a name, the new name could be a chain. But if he kept the old name within, even silent, perhaps it could be a lockpick. He began small acts of invisible resistance that left no ash. In language drills, he answered flawlessly in Turkish and then, when aloud, offered the proverb's rhythm in the music of his village tongue, only to himself. In the kitchen court, while trimming mint leaves, he pressed one leaf to his nose with his thumb hidden, a scent that remembered sheep and mornings. At night, he recited the geometry of the stars using the names the astronomy master loved, and then whispered the ones his father had used on winter hills. No one could subtract these. They were untradeable. The economy pressed on. A steward who appreciated silence began to place the boy at the end of serving lines where observant boys were less observed. The writing master, who hated waste, set a small tray of scrap parchment aside each afternoon. Boys who had earned trust could take one without asking. The boy took half as often as he wanted. Want was another currency. He preferred to bank it. At the same time, the palace offered brighter hooks. On a festival evening, the outer hall swelled with music. The boy was chosen to carry sherbet again. A court official, silver rings flashing, stopped him with a fingertip. "Your Turkish is good," the man said, smiling, "and your eyes are quick." He slipped a silk tassel into the boy's palm. Approval disguised as trinket, tether disguised as gift. The boy bowed, placed the tassel into his sleeve, and later slid it beneath the thin mattress where it would not look like gratitude on display. When he returned to the dormitory, He found a different kind of token, a small olive wood bead placed on his blanket, unremarkable except for its smell of sun and oil. No tutor would leave such a thing. He looked up. Across the aisle, the runaway, now hauling water by day, sat with his palms on his knees, breathing slow, eyes on nothing. The bead had no inscription. It was simply weight. The boy turned it in his hand, then tucked it into the same seam as the silk tassel. Gold and wood, two economies sharing one pocket. In the weeks that followed, he refined his double gait. In the classroom, his letters were steady and useful, never the best in the row, never the worst. In the courtyards, he handled tasks slightly above his assignment's weight, enough to become a person tutors relied on without imagining they owned. He learned what to forget aloud, the names of doors, the timing of guards, and what to remember quietly, the brief shadow in a tutor's face before a pain in his back, the way the kitchen side gate stuck on humid afternoons. The palace noticed, of course it noticed. Institutions are made of eyes. But because he did not accumulate brightness in a single corner, light slid off him and pooled his competence. That was the safest wealth. One evening on the astronomy terrace, the master asked each boy to mark the star that would guide a traveler east. The boy chose a point just off the one the others selected, then explained that wind and coastal glow would require a correction. The master's mouth tilted in approval. "You do not only obey the sky," he said. "You consult it." He handed the boy a dried fig and half a page of scrap, payment in the currency the palace respected, attention and paper. Not all currencies were soft. The older student returned to the dormitory corridor on a night when fog blew in from the Bosphorus and the lattice furred with moisture. "A reminder," he said, pausing at the boy's bed. "The first price of escape is not your body. It is your allies. If you fail, their days grow heavier." He tapped the bead under the boy's pillow as if he could smell wood through silk. "Spend what you carry wisely." The boy lay awake after he left, the city's damp breathing through the lattice. He counted the steps to the northern stair, the time a guard's loop took around the cypress court, the angle the moon cut between two domes at midnight in this season. He did not plan to run. He planned to walk a path so efficiently through the palace's pattern that it would feel, one day, like he had passed through a wall by choosing where the seams already were. At dawn, the bell breathed again. The bowls steamed, the pens lifted, the numbers balanced. The runaway's month of water hauling ended. He rejoined the line thinner, eyes darker, posture unchanged. The bead remained beneath the boy's pillow. He understood the arithmetic now. Privilege was interest the palace paid to those who proved easy to use. Dependence was debt taken at the wrong rate. Escape was not a night and a river. It was years of small subtractions, of oneself from the pattern. Until, when the gate finally swung, the opening looked like routine. In that calculus, he found his place. Not the brightest star, not the darkest corridor, but the steadiness between them that made both legible. He would learn, serve, accept the friction the day required and reduce the rest by craft. He would bank names and cents and sky angles beneath his tongue. And when the palace offered silk, he would weigh it against wood. The economy would keep humming around him. He would hum, too, but to a tune the ledgers could not hear. By the time the boy turned 16, he had become a creature of precision. Every breath, every movement, every thought followed the rhythm of the palace bell. He had grown taller, his posture straight as a column, his Turkish flawless, his manners refined to the edge of invisibility. To the tutors, he was a success story. The quiet boy who learned quickly, obeyed perfectly, and asked for nothing. But beneath the polished surface, another self endured, the one who still counted stars in a language no one here remembered, who still heard his mother's voice when the wind slipped through the lattice at night. The palace rewarded reliability with proximity. He was now assigned to the inner court, where the Sultan's advisors worked and decisions for the empire were sealed in ink. It was the heart of order, and the first circle of temptation. He carried scrolls between rooms, poured sherbet for men who discussed wars as if they were chess games, stood silently by the walls while viziers spoke of punishments, treaties, and taxes that would crush distant villages not unlike the one he came from. Everywhere he turned, he saw power dressed as beauty, gold calligraphy curling over doors, fountains that whispered over marble basins shaped like tears, gardens where tulips were bred for color, not scent. It was perfection without mercy, a kingdom made from symmetry and silence. The boy moved through it all like a ghost. He had become what the palace needed, useful and unnoticed. But in this new sphere, invisibility was both shield and trap. The higher one rose, the fewer places there were to hide. One evening, as he delivered a message to the chief treasurer's chamber, he heard laughter, the kind that comes from men who have forgotten the existence of limits. The treasurer, heavy with jewels and wine, waved him closer. "Come, boy," he said, "translate this." He pointed to a letter from a Venetian envoy, written in clumsy Ottoman Turkish. The boy translated smoothly, his voice calm, precise. The treasurer chuckled. "Good," he said. "You have a scholar's tongue and a servant's eyes." It was meant as praise. The boy bowed, but inside, something recoiled. A servant's eyes, trained to see everything, to remember nothing. That night, he stared at the water basin in his chamber and whispered his old name beneath his breath, a sound forbidden, almost forgotten. It felt like striking flint. For a moment, warmth returned to the cold geometry of his existence. In the months that followed, he began to notice the fractures in perfection. The eunuchs who enforced discipline whispered prayers before sleep, their own scars hidden beneath silk. The tutors who preached obedience drank secretly from bottles of foreign wine. The older students, once proud models of virtue, fought quietly over positions, over proximity to patrons, over which of them would be noticed by the Sultan's advisors. Every rule here was made to be bent, provided one bent it gracefully. And every act of virtue was only one step away from performance. The boy realized that morality inside the palace was like the reflections on marble floors, bright, beautiful, but untouchable. He found himself drawn to one figure, Hassan, a fellow student a few years older, sharp-eyed and restless. Hassan was daring in small, precise ways, answering tutors with wit that skirted the edge of insolence, reading poetry that had been quietly banned. Once, after lights out, Hassan whispered, "Do you ever think they built this palace not to educate us, but to see how much of ourselves we'd give away before we vanished?" The boy said nothing, but he thought about it for days. Hassan became both a friend and a mirror. Together, they served in the Hall of Petitions, where commoners from across the empire came to present grievances to the Sultan's court. The boy translated, his voice formal and steady, while Hassan took notes. A peasant from Rumelia begged for his son's release from a tax prison. A widow sought justice for a soldier who had taken her land. The boy recorded their words with perfect calligraphy, knowing full well most petitions would never be read again. That night, he told Hassan, "We write in ink what they live in blood." Hassan smiled sadly. "Then at least let the writing be beautiful." It was a dangerous friendship, born in whispers and glances, in shared silence when others would have spoken. They never discussed escape, only observation. Watching the palace, mapping its breathing. But observation could also be betrayal. One winter evening, the eunuch summoned him. "The chief scholar requests you," he said. The boy followed, heart steady. The chief scholar's chamber was lined with astrolabes, manuscripts, and the smell of parchment. The old man gestured for him to sit. "You have served well," he said, "and you are clever enough to know why you are here." The boy stayed silent. "There are rumors," the scholar continued. "Students reading foreign poetry. Speaking of freedom, of self. You are close to Hassan." It was not a question. The boy lowered his eyes. "He studies well, master." The scholar smiled thinly. "So did those who burned the libraries in Alexandria." He leaned forward. "The palace forgives nothing. Remember that." When the boy returned to the dormitory that night, Hassan's bed was empty. The sheets were already changed. The lesson was delivered without words. Days passed, then weeks. Life in the palace continued as if nothing had shifted, but the boy moved differently. Every bow, every task, every syllable became armor. He did what was required, flawlessly, silently, invisibly. But somewhere inside, something had changed course. He began keeping a secret record, carved not in paper but in memory, the names of every boy who vanished, every steward who smiled too sweetly, every act of quiet rebellion that flared and died. He told himself that one day, when the palace grew old and historians came to praise its beauty, he would remember the names behind its perfection. His loyalty did not break. It mutated. He became, in time, one of the most trusted scribes in the inner court. The eunuchs consulted him for translations. The tutors praised his discretion. Even the scholar who had interrogated him nodded when they crossed paths. The palace had succeeded and failed. It had shaped him into the servant it wanted, but not into the believer it intended. Sometimes, while copying decrees by candlelight, he would slip his old name into the text, not written in words, but in rhythm, the curve of a letter, the spacing of a line, the shape of a flourish that only he could decode. Tiny rebellions, invisible to every eye but his own. Years later, when foreign ambassadors visited and marveled at the education of the Sultan's household, the boy, now a man, stood among the attendants with a stillness so perfect it seemed divine. They saw the silk, the order, the brilliance of the empire's sons. They never saw the scars that built it. And though his face betrayed nothing, inside he repeated a single truth, shaped from every lesson the palace had taught him. Power remembers obedience. People remember kindness. But the soul remembers everything. The palace would keep turning, its marble corridors echoing with the footsteps of new boys learning to bow, to write, to serve, to forget. But somewhere, deep within the rhythm of its perfect silence, one memory would persist, not of glory, but of endurance. The empire could name him, reshape him, dress him in silk and gold. But it could never fully own the voice that, even now, whispered beneath every obedient breath. I was taken, I was taught, but I am still mine. Years folded like pages. Seasons brushed across Istanbul's domes. Spring rains that polished the marble, summers that baked it white, autumn winds that carried salt from the Bosphorus. The boy had become a man, and the man had become a function of the palace, efficient, loyal, invisible. He had outlasted tutors, scribes, eunuchs, even a sultan. Yet somehow, the palace itself had not aged. Its fountains still whispered, its halls still shimmered, and its silence remained as perfect as the day he arrived. He now served as chief scribe of the inner court. The ink that once stained his fingers in nervous tremor now moved with the calm of ritual. Each morning, he unrolled decrees that would ripple across the empire, edicts of war, peace, taxation, marriage, decisions that altered lives he would never see. He wrote with precision and detachment, his handwriting flawless, his mind empty. It was how one survived inside the machine, by becoming one of its gears. But at night, when the corridors emptied and the marble cooled, he would linger. His desk, once lit by candles, now glowed with the faint silver of the moon through the lattice. On those nights, he no longer wrote. He read. Hidden in a drawer beneath ledgers of empire were scraps of forbidden memory, verses from foreign poets, fragments of letters written by vanished friends, and one page he had written himself many years ago. The ink had faded to a ghostly brown, but the words remained. I was taken, I was taught, but I am still mine. He had copied it only once, not for rebellion, but for truth. The palace taught obedience, but obedience without understanding was emptiness. He had learned the rhythm of power, the balance between submission and survival. He had seen cruelty wrapped in ceremony, devotion performed as display. He had learned that the empire's beauty was built from the bones of boys who never came home. Sometimes he thought of Hassan, his lost friend, of the night when his bed went cold and never warmed again. No one ever spoke his name, but the man carried it like an ember in his chest. Other nights, he remembered the runaway who had returned half-drowned, his punishment silent but unending. The bead of olive would still lay hidden in the hem of his robe, smoothed by decades of touch. It had become his talisman, a fragment of the world before marble and ink, before the empire had renamed him. Years had taught him that memory was a dangerous gift. It was not rebellion that the palace feared. Rebellion could be crushed. It was remembering that could not be contained. As age crept in, his role grew heavier. The Sultan trusted him with the archives, where centuries of documents rested in orderly silence. The air smelled of dust and iron, the scent of power fossilized. The man walked among shelves that stretched like veins through the building, carrying the empire's pulse. Every record was a life translated into numbers and seals, villages burned for tribute, marriages arranged to secure peace, shipments of grain rerouted to starve rebellions. History, he realized, was written to protect the powerful, not to remember the truth. One night, during a storm that rattled the shutters, he came across a box mislabeled in the corner of the archive. Its wax seal was cracked, its parchment tag faded. Inside were records from his own generation of the Indorun school, rosters of names, dates of entry, notes on conduct, and in many cases, the word dismissed. He turned the pages slowly, recognizing faces behind the letters. Dmitri, Nikos, Hassan, all reduced to ink and verdict. Reassigned, lost, recalcitrant. The handwriting was elegant, merciless. And then he saw it. His own name, not the one given at birth, but the one the Empire had written over it. Next to it, exemplary, compliant, promoted. His stomach clenched. For the first time in decades, he felt the walls tilt. The word compliant seemed to hum with quiet cruelty. It was not false, he had survived by compliance, but it was incomplete. There was no column for endurance, no line for hidden defiance, no mark for the thousands of small silences that had kept his soul breathing. He blew out the lamp and stood in darkness, the rain whispering on the glass. Around him, the shelves stretched endlessly, a mausoleum of obedience. And yet, beneath all that ink, he could hear something else, a heartbeat, faint but steady. It was the sound of all the boys whose names had been recorded and forgotten. That night, he made a decision that was neither rebellion nor loyalty. He began to rewrite, not the decrees of sultans, but the records of the lost. On scraps of discarded parchment, in the margins of ledgers, he wove fragments of memory into the official archive. A word here, a phrase there, enough to survive unnoticed, but enough to whisper across centuries. He wrote of the road that bled, of the boys who sang in foreign tongues, of the silence that covered screams. He did it quietly, year after year. The empire grew, declined, renewed. Sultans came and went. The palace changed its decorations, but not its hunger. Still, his hidden script multiplied, buried within the bureaucratic perfection of empire, like seeds under frost. One morning, as he climbed the steps to the courtyard, his legs trembling with age, he paused. The city below shimmered in sunlight, domes glinting, ships cutting through the Bosphorus. He could hear laughter from the courtyards, the same laughter that had once belonged to him. A new generation of boys in white linen marched in rhythm, their eyes bright with fear disguised as pride. He watched them pass through the same marble gates that had swallowed him long ago. None looked up. None ever did. He smiled, not in bitterness, but in understanding. History was a circle, and he had learned to walk inside it without losing his way. He could not break the system, but he had inscribed humanity inside its machine. His rebellion was not noise, it was preservation. That night, he returned to the archives one last time. The corridors were empty, the lamps low. He carried with him the olive bead, the silk tassel, and the parchment bearing his first hidden phrase. He placed them inside a box and sealed it beneath a ledger titled Accounts of the Treasury, Year of the Rose. Then he sat at his desk and wrote a final entry. To the one who finds this, remember not the sultan, nor the scholars, nor the gold. Remember the boys. Remember that silence is not peace, and obedience is not faith. We were made to serve, but we learned to endure. That, too, is history. When the dawn light finally entered the lattice, it found the scribe still seated, his hands folded over his quill, his face peaceful. The ink in the well had dried. Centuries later, when the palace became a museum and visitors walked through its glittering halls, they would stop at the scriptorium exhibit and marvel at the perfection of Ottoman calligraphy. They would see only beauty. They would not notice the faint irregularities, the strange rhythm hidden in the lines, the symbols that repeated like quiet heartbeats between words. Somewhere, a historian might pause, frown, and wonder why certain letters curved in ways no manual prescribed. He might trace them and find, beneath the language of empire, a voice whispering still. We were taken, we were taught, but we were still ours. And in that whisper, buried beneath centuries of marble, ink, and empire, the boy's story would continue to breathe, immortal in silence. Centuries have passed. The empire that once ruled continents has dissolved into dust and names. The palace still stands, magnificent, serene, gleaming under the Turkish sun, its domes polished by wind and rain, its courtyards filled with tourists holding cameras and bottled water. The marble that once felt the bare feet of terrified boys now bears sneakers and sandals, the air filled not with whispered orders, but with the murmur of guides and the clicks of shutters. The Topkapi Palace has become a museum, a monument to beauty, art, and empire. Yet behind every polished tile and golden arch lies something unspoken, something the tour guides do not mention. The walls still remember. The corridors still echo with footsteps that no longer belong to anyone living. In one of the quieter galleries, a young historian walks slowly past the glass cases. Her name is Layla. She was born centuries after the palace's power had ended, but something in its silence has always called to her. Unlike most visitors, she doesn't rush. She touches the cold marble walls with reverence, as if tracing an invisible pulse. She has spent years studying Ottoman bureaucracy, reading the empire's vast archives, tax records, trade manifests, decrees, but she knows those papers lie. They tell the story of structure, not of souls. Her research focuses on what the records omit, the human cost of obedience, the silence beneath perfection. In the dim light of the manuscript room, she finds herself drawn to a ledger labeled Accounts of the Treasury, Year of the Rose. The parchment is brittle, its ink faded to amber. She opens it carefully, expecting figures and seals. But between the columns of numbers, she notices something odd, a curve, a flourish, a pattern that doesn't belong. It repeats, faint but deliberate, small variations in the script, like a secret language woven into the margins. She leans closer. The shapes aren't random. They form words, disguised as ornamentation. Her breath catches as she begins to decipher them. Remember not the sultan, nor the scholars, nor the gold. Remember the boys. Her hands tremble. The handwriting is elegant but human, a century older than any signature in the room. She reads on, tracing each word until tears blur the ink. The voice of the forgotten scribe, the boy who had been taken, taught, renamed, had survived the centuries. Hidden beneath the language of empire, his truth had outlasted kings. Layla closes the ledger and sits in silence. Outside, the sound of footsteps echoes down the corridor. Visitors laughing, guides explaining the glory of the Ottoman court. But to her, the palace suddenly feels alive again, filled not with grandeur but with ghosts. She imagines them, boys in linen, eyes wide and uncertain, walking through the same halls now flooded with sunlight. She imagines their hands, their fear, their whispered dreams. The marble seems to breathe around her, as though exhaling centuries of grief. That night, back in her small apartment overlooking the Bosphorus, Layla cannot sleep. She opens her notebook and begins to write, not an academic paper, but something raw and personal. She writes of beauty born from cruelty, of empires built on silence, of the education that was also erasure. She writes about how history polishes its monuments while hiding its wounds. And she writes about one boy, unnamed, unseen, but eternal, who refused to disappear entirely, who turned memory into resistance. As she writes, she feels the strange weight of connection, across time, across generations, between the living and the forgotten. It feels like a conversation whispered through marble and ink. Weeks later, she returns to the palace with her camera and a small notebook. She moves through the familiar halls again, but now her gaze is different. She doesn't look at the treasures behind glass or the golden calligraphy that dazzles tourists. She looks at the corners, the cracks, the quiet spaces where the light falls softly and the sound fades. In the old dormitory wing, now a restored exhibition of the palace school, she stops by a small alcove where the walls curve inward, catching the morning sun. She takes a photograph, then sits down on the cold stone floor and closes her eyes. For a moment, she hears it, faint, distant, but unmistakable, the rhythm of breathing, the shuffle of bare feet, the soft hum of boys reciting prayers in languages not their own. And then, just as quickly, the sound fades. She whispers, "I remember you." And in that moment, something shifts, not in the walls, but in her. She understands what the scribe must have felt when he wrote those secret lines, the desperate need to make loss visible, to make memory outlive the hand that wrote it. Months later, her paper is published under the title, The Unrecorded Children of Empire. Hidden Voices in Ottoman Bureaucracy. It's a modest piece in an academic journal, but among historians, it sparks quiet astonishment. No one had ever found such a subtext before, a human voice encoded inside official records. Layla receives emails from colleagues across the world praising her discovery. Yet the part she cherishes most isn't the recognition. It's the certainty that somewhere, beyond the reach of empire, one forgotten life has been remembered. Years pass. The museum renovates its archive exhibit, adding a new section called Whispers of the Palace. Inside a glass case, under soft light, rests the very ledger Layla found. Open to the page where the hidden words curve across the parchment. A small plaque reads, "Anonymous scribe, ca 16th century." Inscribed beneath imperial text, this message was found centuries later by historian Layla Karaman. Its hidden lines bear witness to those erased from official history. Tourists stop, look, and move on. But sometimes someone lingers, a child, perhaps, staring at the page, not knowing exactly why it matters, but feeling that it does. And in the quiet after hours, when the last visitors have left and the lights dim, the palace breathes again. The air carries the faintest echo, not of footsteps or command, but of a pen scratching softly on parchment, long ago. Outside, the city lights shimmer on the Bosphorus, and the moon rises over the domes. The wind that drifts through the garden smells of salt and roses. Somewhere, a nightingale sings, the same song, perhaps, that a frightened boy once heard centuries before. History moves on, as it always does. Empires rise and fall. But memory, true memory, endures not in marble, nor gold, nor power. It endures in names whispered back into existence, in the quiet act of remembering those the world has forgotten. The story does not end with kings. It ends, and begins, with the children they never saw as human. And as the wind sweeps across the palace, through the chambers of marble and time, it carries with it a single, eternal truth written once by a trembling hand. We were taken, we were taught, but we are still ours. The palace breathes differently at night. When the tourists leave and the lights dim, the silence settles like fine dust over marble. The moonlight, cold and silver, glides across the ancient courtyards, slipping through lattice windows and brushing the inscriptions that once proclaimed imperial glory. But in that stillness, something deeper stirs, something that cannot be captured in any museum guide or history book. It is the sound of memory, and it does not fade. The boy who was taken centuries ago, the scribe who learned to write obedience, the man who hid rebellion between his inked lines. His story does not belong to him alone. It belongs to all who were consumed by empire and reshaped by its hunger for perfection. It belongs to the thousands of children whose names never left the palace gates. History tends to forget them. Power prefers clean stories, the golden domes, the refined art, the music that filled the courtyards. But the truth of beauty is that it always hides its price. Every polished tile is a mirror, and if you look long enough, you can see the reflection of those who paid for it. And yet, the story is not only tragedy. There is something almost holy in the endurance of memory, in the way a single hidden sentence can survive centuries of empire, fire, and denial. The next morning, as the first sunlight bleeds into Istanbul, the palace awakens again. Gardeners sweep the paths, guides prepare their microphones, and the scent of wet stone rises from the courtyards. From the museum balcony, Layla watches the city stirring to life. Ferries crossing the Bosphorus, the call to prayer echoing from minarets. The same call that once woke boys from their dreams. She clutches her notebook, its pages now filled with fragments, translations, reflections, and the story of the anonymous scribe. Her article has reached more readers than she ever imagined. A filmmaker has written to her. A schoolteacher in Thessaloniki has asked for permission to read the story to her students. Descendants of forgotten families across the Balkans, Anatolia, and Greece have begun sending messages, each claiming to have heard whispers of similar fates. For the first time, the forgotten are being spoken of, not as statistics or curiosities, but as people. Still, Layla knows remembrance is fragile. Memory is not a monument. It is a living thing that must be tended like fire. If left alone, it fades into the same silence that once consumed the boys of the palace. She decides to return once more to the archives, not as a scholar, but as a witness. She brings flowers, white lilies, and places them quietly in a corner of the manuscript hall. No sign marks the spot, no plaque bears the names. But she knows that here, somewhere under the marble and dust, the echoes of those lives still dwell. As she kneels, she hears again in her mind the words of the scribe. Power remembers obedience. People remember kindness, but the soul remembers everything. The phrase had haunted her since the day she found it, scrawled faintly at the bottom of a margin, invisible to all but a patient eye. Now, it feels like a bridge, not just between past and present, but between all who have ever lived under the weight of silence. She looks up. A soft light filters through the colored glass, painting the walls in patterns of red and blue. The colors shift slowly, like breathing. And in that color, she feels not sorrow, but connection. These walls are not just witnesses to cruelty. They are vessels of endurance. The empire that broke those children's bodies could not erase their spirit. The fact that she stands here now, reading their words, proves it. That evening, she walks along the Bosphorus. The wind carries the scent of salt and jasmine, and the water reflects the lights of the city. Somewhere across the strait, the outlines of the palace glimmer faintly, domes and towers shimmering in the distance. She imagines the boy again, his small figure standing by a window centuries ago, looking out at the same water, dreaming of home. And suddenly, the centuries collapse. Time folds into itself. She realizes that history is not a straight line, but a tide, retreating, returning, reshaping. The sea has always known the truth, that memory is stronger than empire. The next week, she gives a public lecture titled The Children of Silence, Rediscovering Humanity in Empire's Shadow. The room is packed. Historians, artists, journalists, and even school children fill the seats. On the screen behind her glows an image of the scribe's handwriting, projected large enough to fill the wall. She begins softly. We like to think that history is written by the powerful. But sometimes, the most enduring truths are written by those who had no power at all. They write in margins, in whispers, in the spaces between rules. And if we listen carefully, we can still hear them. Her voice doesn't tremble. It flows like the Bosphorus, calm, deep, unstoppable. As she speaks, the audience grows silent. For the first time, the palace's story is not about sultans, nor wars, nor grandeur. It is about the unseen, about how even in the heart of absolute power, a human being found a way to remain himself. When she finishes, the applause feels subdued, reverent. A young boy from the audience, no older than 12, approaches her afterward. He looks shy, but his eyes are bright. My grandmother, he says, was from a small village in Bulgaria. She used to tell me stories about boys who never came back. I thought they were just tales. Layla smiles gently. Maybe they were. But sometimes, stories are the only way truth survives. He nods slowly, as if understanding something vast and wordless. Later that night, when Layla walks home through the narrow streets, she glances once more at the palace, its silhouette glowing against the night sky. She feels no anger now, only awe, not for its grandeur, but for what it contains, proof that humanity endures even in its darkest architecture. Because every empire is built on silence. But somewhere, always, someone writes in the margins. Someone refuses to vanish. The marble will outlast everyone, kings, scribes, and scholars alike. But inside that marble, beneath its cool perfection, lies the pulse of the forgotten. It beats quietly, but endlessly. And as the wind passes through the palace gates, as dawn begins to rise again over Istanbul, the light touches the same stones where it once fell on frightened children. Their shadows stretch across time, not as victims, but as witnesses. For in the end, that is what history truly is, the echo of those who endured when no one was watching. And so the story closes, not with the empire, not with the scholar, but with the silence that follows and the quiet promise it carries, that the past is never gone. It only waits to be seen, heard, remembered. We were taken, we were taught, but we are still ours. The words remain, written not on parchment but in the very air of the palace, circling endlessly through marble corridors, the eternal heartbeat of remembrance. The night fell over Istanbul like a veil of velvet and smoke. The Bosphorus shimmered with faint streaks of silver light, and the air carried the perfume of salt, jasmine, and old stories. From the sea, the Topkapi Palace stood like a dream suspended above the city, majestic, eternal, and silent. Yet for those who had once lived within its walls, silence had never meant peace. Inside, the marble halls gleamed under soft illumination. The tourists were gone, the guides had gone home. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the city beyond the walls, faint traffic, distant prayer, the heartbeat of a modern world unaware that it was walking over centuries of grief. In the manuscript gallery, the ledger of the anonymous scribe rested beneath glass, where Layla had placed it months before. The museum's night guard, an older man named Yusuf, paused during his rounds and looked at it, as he always did. He didn't know much about the inscription, but he liked to stop there for a moment of stillness. Sometimes he thought he could almost hear something when he stood close enough, a soft rustle, like the faint turning of parchment. Tonight, the air felt heavier than usual. As he stood there, the faint reflection of his lantern danced across the glass, and for an instant, he saw not his own face, but another's. A boy's, 12, maybe 13, barefoot, dressed in white linen, his eyes dark and endless. The boy looked directly at him, calm, not frightening, just present. Yusuf blinked, and the reflection was gone. The room was still. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head, but something deep inside told him not to be afraid. The palace was full of echoes, he thought. Maybe some echoes choose to stay. That same night, across the city, Layla couldn't sleep. The success of her lecture and her discovery had made her name known in academic circles, but it had also left her with a strange emptiness. She had given the forgotten a voice, but what now? Could remembrance ever truly be enough? She got out of bed and walked to her window. From there, she could see the faint glow of the palace across the water. Its domes were bathed in silver moonlight, and for a moment, it looked less like a building and more like a living memory, vast, breathing, awake. She thought of the scribe again, of his final words. We were taken, we were taught, but we are still ours. That sentence had become her compass, her creed. She had printed it in her article, quoted it in lectures, even whispered it to herself before sleep. But tonight, it struck her differently, no longer as an act of defiance, but as a statement of peace. The boy had not only survived, he had found a way to transcend his suffering, to leave a trace so powerful that it reached across 5 centuries. As dawn approached, Layla made her way to the palace again. The guards knew her by now. She showed her credentials, and they let her in with a quiet nod. The air was cool and filled with the scent of stone after night rain. The corridors glowed softly in the pre-dawn blue. She entered the manuscript hall and stood before the glass case. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the climate controls. She looked down at the ledger, her reflection merging with the inked letters. Good morning, she whispered. Her breath fogged the glass for a second before fading away. The words beneath the surface glimmered faintly in the dim light. For a moment, she thought she saw them rearrange, just a trick of the eyes, perhaps, or maybe not. The letters seemed alive, fluid, as if whispering back. Then, from somewhere deep within the palace, a soft sound, a single drop of water, echoing through the marble corridors. Then another, then silence again. It was as though the palace itself was listening. Layla reached into her bag and pulled out a small piece of parchment she had brought with her, her own handwriting, her own message. She had copied it carefully in Ottoman script, line by line, as a gesture of gratitude to the one who had written before her. It read, "You are remembered. Your words are free, and through them, so are you." She unfolded it slowly, slid it under the edge of the glass case, where it would remain unseen but present, a dialogue across centuries, between 2 scribes who had never met but shared the same vow, to keep memory alive. Outside, the first call to prayer echoed through the city, rising and falling like a tide. The light touched the domes of the palace, turning their silver into gold. The sea below shimmered. The day began. Layla stayed for a long moment, her eyes closed, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. When she finally turned to leave, she looked back once more. The palace no longer seemed silent. It felt peaceful. As she stepped out into the courtyard, a group of schoolchildren passed her, their voices bright and curious. One little girl, holding a guidebook, stopped to stare at the golden gates. "Miss," she asked, "is it true that ghosts live here?" Layla smiled softly. "No, not ghosts," she said. "Memories." The child nodded as if that made perfect sense, then ran to join her class. The camera, if there had been one, would linger as Layla walked down the colonnade, the wind stirring her hair, the sunlight catching the edges of the marble, making everything glow. In that light, faintly, almost imperceptibly, the silhouettes of young boys seemed to walk beside her, not as shadows of suffering, but as guardians of truth. Their outlines were transparent, shimmering in gold and blue. They passed through the gates and vanished into the sunlight, their faces peaceful, their burden finally lifted. At the far end of the courtyard, Layla paused and turned back once more. The palace loomed behind her, majestic, ancient, alive. The air shimmered slightly, as if vibrating with a sound too soft for human ears. If one listened closely, one could almost hear it. Not a cry, not a chant, but a whisper. The same whisper that had crossed centuries to find her. "We are still ours." And then, just like that, the sound faded into the wind. The palace stood silent again, but this time, it was not the silence of forgetting. It was the silence of remembrance fulfilled. As the camera pulled back, rising over the domes and courtyards, the city below came into view. The Bosphorus gleaming, the minarets piercing the dawn, ships gliding across the water. The light spread, spilling over Istanbul, touching stone, sea, and sky alike. Somewhere within that vastness, history exhaled, not in tragedy, but in grace. Because remembrance, once spoken, never dies. It lives in ink, in breath, in the spaces between words. It lives in the quiet places of the world where no one is watching, waiting for someone to listen. And if you stand in the palace at dawn, in that perfect silence, and close your eyes, you might still hear it. The sound of boys running through marble corridors. The rustle of parchment. The whisper of survival. The empire is gone. The marble remains. But the human soul, it endures.